IVM
2019. A whole year has gone by. How did you celebrate it? A night out with booze and friends, resolutions by the dozen, and the will to keep them? Maybe you spent it at India Gate or Shaheen Bagh, protesting with candles and heavy hearts. Maybe you were in bed like I was. Whatever it is, 2019 is done and dusted, and I hope it was kind to you. If the first week of January is an indicator of what is to happen in the rest of the year, then we're in for troubled times. Since the 1st of Jan, the United States has announced that it has killed Iran's most powerful military commander, General Qasem Soleimani, in an airstrike. The Iraq parliament voted to expel US forces, and the US military said it was suspending anti-ISIS operations with Iraq. Then, on the 5th of Jan, yesterday, Iran put out a statement saying that it would have, quote, no limitations, unquote, on enriching uranium, but would continue its cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency. Meanwhile, bushfires rage over in Australia, and in Delhi, state-sanctioned violence against Jawaharlal Nehru University saw thugs beat up teachers and students alike, while the police did nothing but stand idly by. But this podcast is not 2020. This is a review of 2019's foreign affairs in India. Welcome to States of Anarchy. My name is Hamsini Hariharan, and every week on the podcast, I discuss global affairs and foreign policy. While there's a lot to expect from 2020, I thought it would be a good idea to reflect on the sphere of global affairs in the last year, the trends that have emerged, the changes that took place, both good and bad. Unlike the monthly roundups that I host, this, my friends, is a roundup of the whole of 2019. When I look back over the year, I saw 7 major stories that stood out. These are the stories that affected everything else in the Indian foreign policy calculus. They're stories of politics, of power, of violence and negotiations. That's the nature of international relations as we know in an anarchical world. The first story begins in our own country. 2019 was the year of the 17th Lok Sabha elections, following which the BJP came to power for a second consecutive term. Most of what happened in the few months before polling was obviously a part of a carefully orchestrated plan to secure vote banks. The weapon of choice this year was terror. Following the 14th February attacks in Pulwama that killed more than 40 CRPF paramilitary troopers, the BJP went on an offensive with airstrikes in Balakot. Other diplomatic steps include the withdrawal of the most favoured nation status that was given to Pakistan, a move that cut trade ties between the two neighbours. While there's been a narrative battle between India and Pakistan about whether or not the strikes actually hit their intended target, a Jaish-e-Mohammed training camp, there's been a fair deal of speculation in India about the same. However, with the BJP dominating the narrative battle within India, the fight against terror certainly contributed to their victory, coupled with the support that they received from the Hindu majority of the country. So there it was. With the counting having concluded on the night of 23rd May, the start of the second term of the BJP was established. Their manifesto came with several major promises, some of which included reinforcing border security, doubling farmers' incomes, the building of the Ram Mandir, the Citizenship Amendment Bill, the abrogation of Article 370, and the institution of a uniform civil code, among others. These have quite obviously formed the basis of major changes that have been taking place in India since May. For instance, on the 5th of August, and following a week of quietly moving tourists out of the state of Jammu and Kashmir, the central government, with the aid of the Indian Army, put the state under lockdown and announced the removal of the special status of Jammu and Kashmir by invoking Article 370 of India's constitution. What this essentially did was to bring all of the internal affairs of the erstwhile Jammu and Kashmir under the purview of the central government. What became a serious point of debate, however, was the manner in which it was implemented. While one group stated that such a move was necessary to unite the nation as a whole in a bid to eradicate terrorism in the region, and others stated that this was a move against the state because of its majority Muslim population. To keep the peace, as the government has said, with respect to several issues, internet shutdowns became the norm. In fact, as of 4th January, Kashmir has been faced with an internet shutdown of 153 days. While internet services were restored in government hospitals and in towns like Kargil, a huge part of the region still remains with no means of communication. And this has affected healthcare, it's affected the economy, and it's affected the lives of people. These internet shutdowns have become the norm under the current government, and it sheds light on a disturbing trend. One thing that you can do is head to internetshutdowns.in, which is a website that has a database that tracks internet shutdowns across the country. It will really give you an insight into the stool of suppression that the government has been using to quell any form of dialogue against their policies or their decisions. Internet shutdowns were also widely used after the Citizenship Amendment Bill was introduced in the parliament. This was another electoral promise of the BJP government. The bill, which became an act after President Ramnath Kovind signed it, says that refugees of any religion except Islam from Afghanistan, Bangladesh and Pakistan will not be treated as illegal immigrants. This resulted in widespread protests breaking across the country, especially after police atrocities were reported at Jamia Millia Islamia University of New Delhi. Support for the students resulted in mass movements erupting not only in Tier 1 cities like Delhi, Mumbai, Chennai and Pune, but also among Tier 2 cities. The protests in several regions turned violent, with the police and goons from the right wing attacking students. Social media yet again has served as the medium for people across the country to coordinate their efforts with respect to organizing protests and to share videos or reports of police brutalities. This is an issue that is starkly dividing the nation into those who say that the act rips apart into the secular fabric of our country and those who hold the need to preserve the only home to Hindus in the world. All throughout, stories of bravery and solidarity came to the fore, with people of all religions coming out against the act in thousands and millions now. What became contentious was the fact that the Citizenship Amendment Bill, coupled with the National Registry for Citizens, would lead to the persecution of Muslims because everybody else would be granted citizenship anyway. As I mentioned earlier, internet shutdowns have a huge role to play here. The government, in a bid to prevent protests and to maintain law and order, instituted internet shutdowns in Delhi, West Bengal, Assam, Rajasthan, and so on. In many instances, internet shutdowns were ordered by state police officers, clearly violating the rules laid down in the Telegraph Act of 1885, which states that at the very least, internet shutdowns can only be approved by the Joint Secretary of the Government of India. If such authorization isn't obtained by the Home Secretary of the Union Government or the state government, clearly there's an arbitrary side to the decisions that are being taken by authorities, which goes against all law and order. That apart, there's also the issue of the Uttar Pradesh government under Yogi Adityanath issuing notices for damages to those who took part in violent protests. More than 30 people have been sent notices in the state of Uttar Pradesh alone to recover roughly 15 lakh worth of damages. The problem here is twofold. The first stems from the government staunchly determined to not back down on the CAA despite the scale of protests. There is clear video evidence of police in Uttar Pradesh damaging cars and property. Prime Minister Narendra Modi, during his first address to the nation after passing of the bill at Ramlila Maidan, said that the government had never mentioned the National Registry of Citizens and those linking it with the Citizenship Amendment Bill were all liars. This brutish attitude is what has given a free rein to all those associated with the BJP to take part in violence. Yogi Adityanath, as a result, stated plainly that he will, I quote, take revenge for the damage caused to public property as a result of the anti-CAA protests. The second aspect of this is that it directly goes against a Supreme Court ruling. In the case of destruction of public and private property versus the state of AP and others, the court made it incumbent on high courts to recover damages and not the governments. So this clearly sets a rather disturbing precedent which could prevent people from coming out to protest against incorrect government policies. Several people in parts of Uttar Pradesh continue to be sent notices by the government in a bid to recover compensation for damages to public property. While a lot of these issues have been playing out on the streets, dominating the news in the last few weeks of the year, the Indian economy has taken a serious beating. The first 2 quarters of the financial year of 2019 recorded the lowest growth rate in almost 6 years. To give you some comparison, the rate of growth in the first quarter of 2018-19 was 8%, and the growth rate in the second quarter of 2019-20 stood at 4.5%. While the Reserve Bank of India's report says that this is merely a cyclical slowdown, several questions have been raised over how long it will take for the economy to get back on its feet. With increasing unemployment, rising prices of commodities, especially onions and potatoes, apart from reducing purchasing capacities, both in rural and urban areas, the economy will need a carefully curated economic plan if it is to recover as soon as possible. So that was our first, not particularly cheery story about domestic politics. But then, fascism is never particularly cheery now, is it? Our second story is about the breakdown of international institutions. 2019 witnessed both the creation and the breaking down of various partnerships, whether they were strategic or economic. The first and closest to our country is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, or the RCEP, which is an economic bloc initiated by China, originally as a response to the Trans-Pacific Partnership led by the United States. With competition between America's existing formal bloc and China's informal economic dominance in the Asian region, the RCEP was China's attempt to consolidate its hold over the region. Its members included all the countries of ASEAN, India, and 6 others in the region. And as part of the agreement, the member countries would significantly reduce or completely eliminate tariff barriers on trade. This would create a network of free trade between them. Within India, for instance, the idea of joining the RCEP was faced with major skepticism, even criticism, with several groups saying that it would lead to an uncontrollable influx of cheap Chinese imports that would then significantly reduce the purchase of homegrown goods. This, especially at a time when the Indian economy is facing a major slowdown, could be devastating, partly due to reducing consumer purchasing power, both in urban and rural areas. With all of these considerations in mind, Prime Minister Narendra Modi said that India would only consider joining the agreement on the condition that an auto-trigger mechanism would be instituted. It would come into place the moment Chinese imports into India would cross a certain number. However, with such a mechanism not part of this whole structure, India decided to step out of the agreement. Perhaps this was the right decision keeping the current state of economy in mind. But this also poses a greater geopolitical problem for India. Given the competition of sorts that it has with China for regional dominance, India's voluntary seclusion could work out against it, as China could consolidate its hold in the region, leaving India out of the major economic framework. One of the other major events that took place this year was the US and subsequently Russia's withdrawal from the Inf Treaty of 1987. The RCEP was not the only framework to sort of break down. The US and subsequently Russia both withdrew from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty of 1987. The treaty, which was signed by Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev as a means to curb the arms race that took place during the Cold War, faced several problems down the road. In fact, this was the first time that the two states agreed to place limitations on their nuclear programs, and that's what made the INF significant. The US on several occasions said that Russia violated the agreement by continuing to test missiles that could be launched from air or sea. The Kremlin denied the charge and blamed the US for the same thing, which the US in turn denied. Eventually, Donald Trump, in his State of Union address in February 2019, said, and I quote, "While we followed the agreement to the letter, Russia repeatedly violated its terms," end quote. Again, with the pointing of fingers, there have been people on both sides debating the withdrawal of both countries from the treaty. While some people consider it a masterstroke, others say that this is the beginning of a period of doom. The arguments in the favor of this withdrawal of USA is that if Russia has repeatedly violated this agreement, then the US shouldn't be bound by it any further. On the flip side, those against it focus on the reduction in the barriers to arms proliferation. The third important international institution to fall apart happened in December. The World Trade Organization, or the WTO's appellate body, which is mainly in charge of dispute resolution, has been paralyzed when the United States refused to allow for nominations of new members who could adjudicate on disputes. This means that the minimum necessary quorum on decisions can't be met, and the dispute resolution mechanism of the WTO can't really function. The United States has been complaining about issues with the organization for more than a decade now. But it just goes on to show that international institutions have taken a severe delegitimization this year. Another agreement that witnessed dynamic changes was the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, which was signed between Iran and the 6 countries known as the P5+1. These were the US, the United Kingdom, France, Russia, China, and Germany. The agreement was meant to limit Iran's nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief from the United States. However, in May, Donald Trump announced that he was withdrawing the US from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JOCPA, as the Iran nuclear deal was also called. He also announced that the highest level of economic sanctions were going to be implemented on Iran. Iran initially said that it was going to continue to work with the other party states, but it later threatened to enrich uranium beyond the limits agreed to under the agreement. This was a way for Iran to pressure the European member states to convince the US to withdraw sanctions. The US in response sanctioned the supreme leader of the Republic of Iran, Al-Khamenei. Ever since, tensions have only escalated between the two states, with European members urging both sides to resort to a peaceful resolution. As I'd mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, Iran has now said that it is not going to abide by the limitations on enriching uranium, and we're only going to see this story evolve in 2020. It's the beginning of a more assertive Iran. Back in July, Gibraltar's forces and 30 members of Britain's Royal Marines detained Iran's supertanker Grace 1. Iran called this act illegal and threatened the next day that it would seize one of Britain's tankers in retaliation. It also accused the UK of acting on the US's orders to seize Grace 1. Meanwhile, Britain provided military escorts to most of its vessels passing through the Strait of Hormuz to prevent any retaliation from Iran. Then, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, which the US has designated as a terrorist organization, boarded the British-flagged tanker Stena Impero and detained it. They also claimed to have detained another tanker. Following this escalation, the UK decided to join US's maritime security mission in the Middle East to protect the trade of oil from the region. While the US requested Gibraltar to further extend the detention of Grace 1, the latter, on 15th August, said that Grace 1 was legally free to leave. The incident was followed by Greece refusing to allow the now renamed Grace 1 to refuel, while Iran threatened shipping security in the region. Later, it was only on the 27th of September that Iran released the Stena Impero, which remained in detention for little more than a month. From Iran's perspective, the detention of Stena Impero was its means to having the European partners to the Iran nuclear deal pressure the US into relieving economic sanctions. And sanctions bring me to my next big story, oil. The sanctions on Iran, it must be noted, significantly impacted oil imports by other states too. India, for instance, was no longer able to purchase oil from Iran and was forced to look at other sources like Saudi Arabia for its oil needs. The resulting shortage also led to a rise in global oil prices, as nations which had earlier traded with Iran now had to look to alternatives to feed their demand for oil. Oil has been an important issue in 2019. In September, in the Middle East, 2 oil processing plants were rocked by a series of explosions in Saudi Arabia. The facility, along with another oil field to the south, were hit by cruise missiles and drones. The larger facility is one of the world's major providers of oil, and the attack rocked global oil prices. Saudi Arabian officials said that the attacks forced the shutdown of the facilities, cutting the country's oil production from 9.8 to about 4.1 million barrels of oil a day. Saudi Arabian officials said that the attacks forced the shutdown of the facilities, cutting the country's oil production from 9.8 to about 4.1 million barrels of oil a day, losing 5.7 million barrels of oil a day, or about 5% of all global production. Then there's Venezuela, where the whole of the last year has seen the country crippled by political crisis, unable to decide who the rightful head of state is. Political crisis in Venezuela, a major oil producer, also saw its oil exports fall in August to their lowest level ever. For the first half of the year, oil prices were low. In January 2019, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC, actually cut its outlook for global oil demand. And with Russia, they decided to cut down oil supply by 1.2 million barrels per day. This was to stop oil prices from falling even further and creating a glut in the market. But this changes in the second half of the year and will continue to in 2020. This is not really great news for the Indian economy, which heavily relies on imported oil to meet its energy needs. So be ready for costlier diesel in 2020. Our next story is one of protests. In fact, 2019 is possibly the year of protests. And let's start with Hong Kong. Lasting 7 months and still continuing right now in January, Hong Kong has been the center of much focus. These are pro-democracy protests, and they began right after the introduction of an extradition bill in the Legislative Council. It's important to remember that Hong Kong was a British colony until 1997, when it was handed over to the People's Republic of China, on terms that it would have its own political and legal freedom for 50 years. These 50 years come to an end in 2047, but China has been seen as minimizing the borders between Hong Kong and itself already. This has been seen by the protesters as China's violation of the Two Systems Agreement that was supposed to remain in place for almost 3 decades more. The protests have been one of the major ways in which it's doing so. This is because the extradition bill would have allowed for fugitives to be extradited to mainland China, where human rights are not always guaranteed. This sent waves across the island, and more than 1 million people came out onto the streets in protest. While the bill itself was withdrawn, protesters then demanded the resignation of Carrie Lam, the head of the Legislative Council, which still hasn't happened. 2019 is the year of protests because apart from Hong Kong and India, Sudan, Algeria, Venezuela, Ecuador, and countries across Latin America and Africa have come out onto the streets. Sudan has been in the middle of a political crisis ever since the overthrowing of its ruler, Omar al-Bashir, in April. The military and the pro-democracy have been locked in a tussle for power, leading to major protests. However, the start of the crisis can be traced to December 2018, when in an effort to stave off economic collapse, the ruler announced cuts to subsidies on bread and fuel, resulting in the eruption of protests. The movement achieved its major obstacle of having Sudan's leader overthrown on the 6th of April, when protesters stormed the square outside military headquarters, demanding that they force the president out. After 5 days, it was said that he had been overthrown. While a council of generals assumed power on 11th April, they struggled to improve the situation in the country. Couple that with the fact that the army in Sudan isn't the most unified force, leading to paramilitary factions moving to assume power themselves. However, people of Sudan kept coming out in opposition to the idea of a military rule in the country. And after months of consistently protesting outside the military headquarters, the two groups managed to flesh out an agreement, according to which the transitional government would work on a power-sharing basis for 39 months. Elections would be held at the end of this period. This transition is being seen as a major victory for pro-democracy groups in overthrowing the ruler and preventing a military takeover of the Sudanese government. An other country rocked by protests this year was Algeria. Ever since February 2019, tens of thousands of citizens have come out on the streets to protest against President Abdulaziz Bouteflika's decision to run for a 5th term in office. He has been the ruler of the country for 20 years and for the past 6 struggled to speak or walk after having struggled a stroke in 2013. Many people have said that he was a puppet of the military men around him and thus wanted nothing to do with him for another term in office. Succumbing to the protests, he resigned on 2nd of April at the age of 82. In December, Abdelmadjid Tebboune was elected as president. While he was seen as a better alternative to Bouteflika, many considered him to be a part of the elite and they wanted a new system altogether. However, for Tebboune, his timely entry into the whole protest by speaking of the right to protest helped woo part of the population. His promises to bring in more young people into politics and weed out corruption is rhetoric that everyone across the world has said time and time again. 2020 will show how he fares in the face of Algeria's new awakened population and whether or not people accept the work of his government. Venezuela is yet another country that was hit by protests this year. It's no wonder that 2019 was called the year of protests, as I've said before. The country has been rocked with a political crisis for a few years now, made only worse by skyrocketing inflation, ever so frequent power cuts, and shortages of food and medicine. In Venezuela, this is a tussle between President Maduro and the opposition leader Juan Guaido, who declared himself as acting president on the 23rd of January. This was seen as a direct challenge to Maduro, who's been sworn into office just 2 weeks before. What's interesting is that more than 50 countries have recognized Juan Guaido as the legitimate leader, while China and Russia remain supportive of President Maduro. Since the start of the economic crisis, United Nations figures show that more than 1 million people have left the country. The majority of these people have gone into the neighboring Colombia, while others made their way to Brazil. Those in the country have been protesting for stability in the government and for a return to a stable economy and a reliable government. Our next story is related to violence. It's one of terrorism. 2019 witnessed instances related to terrorism across the world, from the defeat of the Islamic State to the Easter bombings in Sri Lanka. The Islamic State, at its height, controlled almost 88,000 square kilometers across Syria and Iraq and was founded as an offshoot of the Al-Qaeda in 2004. Over several years of fierce battles, however, several local factions that were backed by foreign powers left the group, only to make it much smaller and weaker. In its final battle, which was fought against the Syrian Democratic Forces, or the SDF, in Baghouz in Syria, there were several hiccups, given that there were a lot of civilians in the region. The SDF claimed victory and said that it would continue to fight against ISIS sleeper cells in the region. However, several reports from around August 2019 said that ISIS is regaining strength in the region by conducting guerrilla attacks across Iraq and Syria and simultaneously retooling its financial networks. What also contributed to this re-strengthening is the fact that America reduced its forces in Syria from 2,000 to almost half, reducing support for partners fighting ISIS. As a result of this, members and cells of the ISIS that remained in the Syrian region have supposedly managed to regain a certain degree of presence. While it certainly doesn't seem like it will be able to gain the numbers it once started with, there are currently a little more than 18,000 fighters in the region. Terrorist attacks shook the world in 2019, and one of the most brutal were the coordinated ISIS bombings in Sri Lanka that were executed on Easter Sunday. The bomb, which had detonated in 3 different churches and 3 luxury hotels across 3 cities on the island, killed more than 250 people and injured more than 500. What came surprising once the events transpired was the fact that these were predicted by Indian intelligence, with 2 warnings also been given to their Sri Lankan counterparts. The alerts also named the plotters, but the Sri Lankan intelligence forces refused to act. The bombers were also found to be well-educated, middle-class Sri Lankan citizens. The group consisted of men and 1 woman, with one of the men seeming like he was the leader of this little home-grown Islamic militant group. These attacks have had a serious impact on tourism in Sri Lanka for the rest of the year. Warnings over travel to the country were issued by several nations, but began to be relaxed a few months later. The Sri Lankan government, in a bid to increase tourism as much as it could given the circumstances, reduced airline prices as well. And this brings us to our next story, the neighborhood. Continuing with Sri Lanka, our island neighbor conducted their elections, in which Mahinda Rajapaksa took his oath as Prime Minister, and his younger brother, Gotabaya, was elected as President. Most people, however, were concerned that under the Rajapaksas, large-scale abuses were committed. The state, which is suffering from a slow economy and a crippled security situation, needs strong leadership. And the previous government suffered from intelligence lapses that led to the Easter attacks in April, reinforcing the need for improved intelligence and security in the island. Another country that's seen major increase in violence has been Afghanistan. From July through September of 2019, it has been the worst decade in terms of civilian deaths. According to the figures, 1,174 civilians were killed and 3,139 were injured. These figures further meant that the total number of deaths in Afghanistan in 9 months till September alone amounted to more than 8,000. The other major story this year was the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. Donald Trump stated that he wanted to achieve a complete withdrawal of US troops by November 2020. The deal between the United States and the Taliban over its withdrawal from Afghanistan had been put off over various attacks that took place at the hands of the Taliban through August. For instance, between the end of August and the 19th of September, 259 pro-government forces and 222 civilians were killed in multiple incidents. Talks between the US and Taliban remained called off during this period. However, around mid-December, it was reported that Trump was ready to announce the withdrawal of 4,000 troops from Afghanistan, but no such announcement has been made. This would have roughly left between 8,000 and 9,000 troops in the country. The remaining would be withdrawn in phases before the elections in November 2020. Other events in our neighborhood were reactions to events that took place within India. The abrogation of the special status of Jammu and Kashmir, for instance, created waves in Pakistan for several months. Even Nepal was pleased over the revoking of Article 370 because maps displayed parts of Nepalese territory as parts of India, and it registered strong protest. The Citizenship Amendment Bill, on the other hand, has been creating waves in Bangladesh. Despite the efforts of the Sheikh Hasina government in emphasizing that the CAA is an internal matter of India, discontent is rising among its citizens. In fact, she has also been accused of being soft on India over the issue of the CAA and the NRC. Bangladesh has also reportedly written to Narendra Modi, demanding assurance that the immigrants won't be set across the border after the implementation of the CAA. Even during the implementation of the NRC in Assam, when Sheikh Hasina was on a visit to India, while the Prime Minister did assure her that no immigrants would be sent across the border, no written assurances were given on the grounds that the NRC was enacted based on orders from the Supreme Court of India. Afghanistan has also been displeased on India's portrayal of it as a country where minorities are ill-treated. The Afghan ambassador, Tahir Kadiri, expressed quite clearly that there has been no persecution of minorities since the Taliban were thrown out of power. Pointing to the fact that Kabul even reserves seats for the Sikh community in its parliament, Afghanistan reiterated this position. This is problematic on several fronts, particularly because Bangladesh and Afghanistan are possibly the two countries in the neighborhood with whom India shares good relations. Of course, the Indian government has to realize that its domestic policies will have repercussions in its neighborhood and around the world. The last story is one of Indian foreign policy. India started the year off with the heads of the ASEAN attending the Republic Day celebrations. Prime Minister Narendra Modi continued to fly around the world, raking up mileage points and photo ops with Indian diaspora. In the United States, an event called Howdy Modi was organized in Texas, where he shared the stage with American President Donald Trump, leading to some criticism of whether this befit a head of state. The new government in May also saw an external affairs minister who was actually familiar with foreign policy. S. Jaishankar was formerly in the Foreign Service and has served as India's ambassador to the United States, China, the Czech Republic, and the High Commission in Singapore. However, there's much to be said about the limitations of individual policymakers, so it will be interesting to see how our new External Affairs Minister acts. In September, when he was in the United States, he met with several policymakers and think tanks in Washington, D.C. However, in December, he cancelled talks with a US congressional delegation, which included Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal, who's been a critic of the clampdown in Kashmir. The rise of India's bullish undertones is evident across foreign policy. While the Balakot strikes, opportunely taking place months before the Indian elections, had distinct overtones of nationalism, so did the opening of the Kartarpur corridor. The corridor between Gurdaspur in India and Kartarpur in Pakistan is holy for Sikhs, as the final resting place of Guru Nanak lies there, and this was to be a confidence-building measure between both countries. However, it was overshadowed by petty politicization on both sides. Another interesting foreign policy story this year was huge advancements in terms of space exploration. On the 22nd of July, India launched Chandrayaan-2 on a mission to the south of the moon. This was yet another feather in the cap for India, even though the mission wasn't entirely successful. In fact, it was Chandrayaan-1 which had discovered traces of water vapor in the atmosphere and the surface of the moon. However, the mission lost out on success by the tiniest bit of distance when the ground station lost contact with the Vikram lander, which housed the rover Pragyan, which was just about 2.1 kilometers above the surface of the moon. It was unclear whether or not the lander reached the requisite speed to be able to make a soft landing, or whether it would have been able to and sustain the magnitude of the damage. Either way, we have no way of knowing. While ISRO continued to make attempts at establishing contact, it turned out rather unsuccessful. They did, however, locate the position of the lander on the moon. This sent waves of emotion across the country. However, it was a significant achievement for ISRO. In fact, ISRO has announced that Chandrayaan-3 will be launched in 2021 and that its plan has already been approved by the government. All eyes will certainly be on the next mission and its ability to successfully achieve a landing on the moon. Coming back to Earth, the G7 summit was held between the 23rd and the 26th of August. What was significant about this was the fact that Prime Minister Narendra Modi was invited to attend it despite not being one of the 7 members of the group. Another foreign policy highlight was the Mamallapuram meeting between Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi. This was the second informal meeting between the two leaders, and it attracted a lot of fanfare from the Indian end about economic relation. But its results are yet to be seen. 2020 marks 70 years of India and China's diplomatic relations, so it will be interesting to see how things work out on that front. Modi also met Xi Jinping at the BRICS summit in November in Brasilia. It's been over a decade that BRICS were formed to take advantage of their high growth rates. But as the decade has ended, so has the high growth in all 5 countries. Overall, there hasn't really been a coherent strand of foreign policy in 2019. And the one that emerges is not of Achhe Din, but an India that is often on the defensive, justifying its stand in Kashmir or on the Citizenship Amendment Act and elsewhere. If it's one thing that I can say, it's that reputational costs in India have been high this year. The government needs to focus on the economy and boosting India's image instead of letting it down. We need a recalibration of foreign policy, one that will recognize the role of China in the neighborhood and elsewhere, the rise in oil prices, the breakdown of the international liberal order. India needs a foreign policy vision for the next 20 years. It's already 2020, and the idea of us being a superpower is almost laughable. But hopefully, it doesn't always have to be this way. That's it for this episode of States of Anarchy. Thank you for staying with us till the end. Despite all the gloom of this episode, I hope you have a lovely year up ahead. If you want to read more about what's happened in 2020, I've attached a bunch of resources for you in the episode description, so you can just scroll down. If you want to delve deeper into some of the topics that we discuss on States of Anarchy, whether it's in public policy or foreign policy, I suggest you check out some of the policy courses at the Takshashila Institution. They're of varying lengths, so you can choose depending on your interest, and you can attend the classes from home, so do check them out. If you have any comments or questions, you can reach out to me at HamsiniH on Twitter and at States of Anarchy on Instagram. You can listen to States of Anarchy not only on the IVM podcast app and website, but wherever it is that you get your podcasts. We'll be back next Tuesday.
Hi, I'm Sarayu Natarajan.
And I'm Alok Prasanna Kumar.
And we are the hosts of the Ganatantra podcast.
On this podcast, we speak to academics, social scientists, journalists, and activists to find out what's actually going on in Indian politics.
On this podcast, we stay away from personality politics, intrigue, and gossip, and instead focus on the data, research, and analysis that drives all this.
So tune in to the Ganatantra podcast, where new episodes are out every Wednesday on the IVM podcast app, website, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
नमस्ते, मैं हूँ सौरभ चंद्रा
और मैं प्रणय कोटस्थाने।
जब महफिल खत्म होते होते दरवाजे के बाहर पुलिया के ऊपर हम दुनिया भर की जटिल समस्याओं को सॉल्व करने में लग जाते हैं तो हो जाती है पुलियाबाजी।
अब आजकल के अपार्टमेंट वालों ने तो कभी पुलिया देखी नहीं होगी, पर आप फीलिंग तो समझ ही सकते हैं।
तो आइए शामिल हो जाइए हमारी पुलियाबाजी में, जहां प्रणय और मैं एक से एक इंटरेस्टिंग टॉपिक्स की तह तक जाएंगे।
आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस, बिटकॉइन, पाकिस्तान, मेडिकल एजुकेशन, करेंसी क्राइसिस, कभी हम दोनों के साथ और अक्सर स्पेशल एक्सपर्ट गेस्ट की कंपनी में।
सुनिए हमें IVM की वेबसाइट, ऐप या अपने फेवरेट पॉडकास्टिंग प्लेटफॉर्म पर हर दूसरे हफ्ते।